right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you if you're joining us online. Thank you so much for joining us. And those of you that are here, thank you for being here as well. We're going to continue on in our Bible study with the miracles of Jesus. And so if you would, we're actually going to look at two sets of scriptures. And so first one is going to be out of Matthew chapter 14. And the second one is going to be in John chapter 6. And so Matthew 14, verse 13, and John 6, verse 1. And so we're going to look at the Matthew verses first. But the title of the message tonight is Jesus Knows Our Hunger. And so again, these are the miracles of Jesus. Jesus doing these different miracles in which that he has. And we've talked about several different ones. Jesus calming the seas and walking on water. We've talked about how he has healed the man at the pool at Bethsaida. We've also talked about how that he had healed the man with that was demon possessed. And so here we're going to talk about how Jesus knows our hunger. And so look here with me, Matthew chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 13. And read through. It says, "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And he went ashore, and he saw a large crowd, and felt compassion for them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away, that they may go into the village and buy some food for themselves.' But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. And there were 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children." And so if you would, go ahead and turn over to John chapter 6, and it's the same story here in John. Again, as I've said before, in the different Gospels, it's just like taking a group of people out and telling them to look at some kind of picture or look at some, if you take them out on a bluff and you're looking out over a valley, and you take this group of people and you tell them to look out and just take in what they see. And then if those people come back and write about what they see, you're going to get several different vantage points of what they saw, because their eyes see different things. They're attracted to different things. And so here, this is kind of what the Gospels are. We have 4 different men that write through the Gospels. And so they're writing these stories, and many of them are from just different vantage points. Even to the point where some of these men are doctors, some of these men are just fishermen, and with that, you're even getting a different, even somewhat of a different educational level in the vantage point in which that they are looking. They're getting not necessarily a different cultural look from things or vantage point from things, but they're still getting different viewpoints just because different people are just different, right? And so the story here that we have, we find here, obviously, the story of feeding the 5,000. 5,000 people. This was considered to be 5,000 men. It says this actually both in John and in Matthew, not counting the women and children. So if we go through and we count the men and women, including the men, we're looking somewhere probably between 10 and 15,000 people that were in this area. This is, somewhere right off of the Sea of Galilee, which were many of the miracles in which that Jesus performed. This is where they happened, right? And so Jesus here he just got some really bad news. If we went back to Matthew and looked, we're not necessarily going to go back there, but Jesus had just gotten some of the worst news that he probably could have gotten, and that was the fact that John the Baptist had just been killed. He had just been beheaded. Now, who is John the Baptist? John the Baptist is who we would consider, John was not a Baptist. I want to make that clear. We call him John the Baptist because he was one that baptized with water, and so he kind of gained the name John the Baptist because he literally baptized with water. So John was not only just a friend of Jesus, he was not only the way maker, really what we would call the way maker for Jesus, or one that prepared the way before Jesus. Not only was he that, but he was also a relative, a cousin of Jesus as well. So Jesus gets this news, and what had happened is Herod had arrested John the Baptist, and it was Herod's birthday, and so they were having this huge party, and Herodias, which was the wife of the king, wanted her. In other words, he wanted to have a relationship with her. And one of the things that John the Baptist continued to tell Herod was, listen, she's not yours. You can't have her. And so John the Baptist finds himself arrested, finds himself in jail. And during his birthday party, the daughter of Herodias comes and dances before Herod. And Herod enjoyed it. It says that it pleased him. And so because it pleased him so much, he tells her, he says, listen, because you have done this for me, I will give you literally anything you want. And so she goes back, she thinks about it, she comes back to him, she says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so as much as Herod had not killed John the Baptist up to this point, because he feared the backlash or the outcry of the people because John the Baptist was so loved. And so he feared that. And so when she comes back and she says, listen, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, he was like, okay, I really don't want to do this, but I made a promise. Plus the king and the king's wife, Herodias, comes and tells him, says, listen, you made her a promise. You have to keep this promise. And so that's exactly what he does. So he ends up having John the Baptist beheaded. And so Jesus gets this news, right? But not only did Jesus just get this news, but we also find that Jesus had just come from a time of ministry. In fact, if you were to go back and read some of the things that Jesus had done, Jesus had met with the Samaritans. He had healed a nobleman's son. The healing Bethsaida, the pool of Bethsaida that was there. He's talking to the people, talking about his equality. In fact, if you go over even back into Matthew. We even see where in his teaching, he's sitting here, he's teaching through parables, and not only is he teaching through the parables, we find several of the other miracles in which that he had done leading up to this particular point. And I'm just going to tell you, ministry is exhausting. When I tell you, one of the things that I love the most about being a pastor is I love hospital visits. And so especially when someone's having surgery, getting to go up and visit with a family and talk with a family, get to know the family. A lot of times you get to meet new people. You get to just you get to know them in a more intimate way, in deeper way, and you just it's just a different setting. And so I love that opportunity when that opportunity arises. And so, but I will also tell you this, is that I have no idea why this happens, but in those moments of being at the hospital, you can ask my wife, I come home, I am mentally, physically, and spiritually just drained. I'm exhausted. I mean, I feel like I just got through running a marathon, and I'm like, I didn't do anything for 8 hours but sit in a chair and talk. But for some reason, it's exhausting. It just is. And so I imagine here Jesus, he's exhausted, he's tired, just going through ministry. And then all of this on the precipice of him receiving the news that his cousin had just died. And in Matthew, it tells us that Jesus kind of goes away, gets this news, he goes away, gets in a boat, and he just wants to go and be by himself. And I understand this. I truly understand this. So a couple of things that I want to point out at this particular point is that when we look at this particular miracle in which that Jesus did, we get to see the humanity of Jesus along with the deity of Jesus. We get to kind of see both of these play into motion here, and probably one of the most, at least one of the more difficult times and seasons of the life and ministry of Jesus was right here in this moment. I mean, he was tired. He'd been doing ministry, gets this bad news. Jesus being fresh off the ministry field, and in fact, at this particular point in time, he had literally just got through healing the man at the pool of Bethsaida, excuse me. But Jesus receives this news, this bad news of his cousin. Jesus wanted to be alone. But the people followed him. And so, to me, when I see Jesus wanting to kind of go and be alone, for me, this is the humanity side of Christ. This is kind of the humanity side of things. Jesus just wanted, he just desired to be alone. He's exhausted, he's tired, he's mourning. And he just wants to be alone. But the people followed him. Right? So Jesus gets in this boat and he goes to the other side and he gets there and by the time he gets to the other side, all the people are already there. So he steps off the boat. And I'm thinking, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of Jesus in this moment, because there's times that this happens, that you're just tired, you're exhausted, from whatever reason it may be. And yet then there's somebody else that needs something, right? And Jesus here sees their need over his own desires or needs. In fact, it says that Jesus had compassion on them. Jesus saw a greater need in them than he did even in his own self. He saw not only their physical need, but he also saw the people in the spiritual need in which that they needed in that very moment. He saw physical, they were hungry, they were probably tired from traveling and walking and being with him as he's been teaching. But also, here he is, that he sees that not only do they need physical sustenance, but they also need spiritual. And so Jesus was willing to set aside his own desires, his own feelings, to minister to them. And so not only do I see the physical or the humanity part or the human part of Jesus, but I also see the deity part of Jesus, because he sets aside himself, his own earthly desires, his own fleshly desires. He sets those aside because he knows that something needs to be done. But I also see that Jesus here shows diversity within his ministry. One of the things that Jesus sees here, if you go back and you read in Matthew chapter 4, in verse 4, we see Jesus coming out from being in the wilderness for 40 days, right? And so one of the things that happens right after Jesus comes out of the wilderness for 40 days, he hadn't eaten or drinking anything. He'd been fasting for all that time, spending time with God. And first thing that happens is Satan comes up, and Satan says, hey, you see that stone over there? Turn it into bread. And Jesus' response in Matthew 4:4 is that he says, listen, man doesn't live on bread alone, but from every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so here, when I see this, is that Jesus addresses in this particular miracle, he addresses the physical, and yet he also addresses the spiritual within the hearts of the people, within the bodies of these people. And Jesus simply says that I'm not just going to give you words, because that's what more times than not, that's exactly what Jesus does for many of the people, is that he heals, right? Is that he's healing them from some kind of ailment. He's reaching out, and he's picking them up. He's picking up the lame and letting them walk, or he's taking a blind, he's making them see, and he's teaching from the mountainside. And that's exactly what he's doing in this very moment right here, is that he's standing there, he's teaching. There's a crowd of people around, but Jesus here simply says, I'm not just going to meet your physical need. I'm not just going to give you, the words, but I'm also going to meet you physically, the needs in which that you have physically. And so here Jesus goes on. So let's pick up here in John chapter 6. He says, and after these things, Jesus went away. Again, this is the same story. Went away to the other side of the sea, the Sea of Galilee, and a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs in which he was performing on those who were sick. And then Jesus went up onto the mountainside there, and he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near, and therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, says to Philip. So here's a little bit of the different vantage point that we get from Matthew versus John, okay? So we don't get this small conversation here from Matthew that we get from John. And so part of this is that Jesus looks at Philip, right, which is one of the disciples, and he tells him, he says, hey, Philip, he says, where are we going to buy bread so that these may eat? So let me kind of put this in layman's terms, or in terms that we would understand. Jesus simply looks at Philip and says, hey, where are we going to get enough food to feed all these people? And that's what Jesus, he's asking Philip this. However, he's not asking Philip this question because he doesn't know. It's not like Jesus is sitting going, man, I don't know how in the world we're going to feed these. Jesus, it's not that. If you continue to read, it says that Jesus asked him this question because he knew what he was about to do. He asked him this question to test him to see what was going to go on. And so here, Jesus asked him and says in verse 6, he says, this was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he intended to do. And Philip answered him. And so Philip comes back and says this, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. So he's simply saying, look, we couldn't feed all these people just a little bit of food for 200 denarii. I mean, there's no way. So let me kind of give you what Philip is saying. So when Jesus asked him this question, where are we going to get enough bread to feed all these people? And Philip's response is, listen, we don't have enough money to feed all these people. One, we don't have enough bread to feed all these people, but we don't have enough money to feed all of these people. I mean, think about this. There's 10 to 15,000 people that are sitting here in front of these disciples and Jesus. I don't know if you've ever stood in front of a crowd that large or not. I would tell you, it looks like a sea of people. Back in my early 30s, I had a band. I was a lead singer in a band, and we got to play for what they call the Choctaw Fest. And one of my lead guitarists, had two lead guitarists. One of my lead guitarists at that particular time was the assistant chief of the Choctaw Nation, which is now the chief of the Choctaw Nation. And so that kind of gave us some perks. In other words, our band got to open for the big bands that were coming. So one year we got to open for Casting Crowns. One year we got to open for Building 429. Another year, I don't remember who Third Day. We got to open for Third Day. And so we got to open some of these big bands, and it was really cool. So I remember standing up there for the very first time, the first year that we got to stand up there. And I remember looking out across the crowd, and probably somewhere between 15 and 25,000 people standing out in front of us, sitting out in front of us. And I remember my stomach just dropping. And I'm thinking, oh my, that's a lot of people. And And, you couldn't even, some of them, people were so far back, you couldn't even make out their faces. And so I tried to put myself in the shoes here with Jesus of looking at is that he sees all of these people, these women and children and men that are all just sitting around. And they're asking, how in the world are we going to feed them? Jesus goes above and beyond just a miracle. Jesus goes above and beyond just a miracle of feeding 5,000 to 15,000 people. It says, if you continue to read, in fact, we're going to, let's pick up here in verse 8. It says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad or a child who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these to so many people? So he says, listen, we've got a couple of fish, we've got a few pieces of bread, but what is a couple of fish and a few pieces of bread to 15,000 people? And so that was the vantage point in which the disciples had, right? And so then Jesus said, have the people sit down. And now there was much grass in the place. And so the men sat down in numbers of about 5,000. And Jesus then took the loaves and having given thanks, he distributed those who were seated, likewise also with the fish, as much, listen to this, as much as they wanted. So not only did Jesus feed them, Jesus stuffed them. Not only did Jesus give them just, some kind of sustenance, not only did Jesus just, give them something to put in their belly, he filled their belly. And then, not only did he just fill them, and here's the other thing, it says all. If you go back and read in Matthew chapter 14, it says that all had their fill. So it wasn't just the men that got full. The women and the children got full too, off of 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. And so then Jesus could have stopped there, right? I mean, very, very much Jesus could have performed this miracle, and it would have been just as great of a miracle if he would have just stopped there. But I think Jesus goes even a step further to bring about leftovers. And to me, when Jesus, he fills everybody's belly, and he says, and not only do I have enough for everybody, but I have more. And I think we lose that. I think we lose that concept in this story. Is that we lose it from the fact that Jesus fed 5,000 to 15,000 people, and we forget about that Jesus is saying, listen, I can feed you to your full, and that in itself is just a massive miracle. But Jesus says, but I have even more. And so he makes some doggy bags for the disciples. So, I mean, think about it for a second. How many baskets were left over? 12. How many disciples are there? 12, right? And so, let me tell you, in ministry, a lot of times, you're the last one to get fed. You're the last one, a lot of times, to get fed. And so here, in this particular setting, I'm sure that the disciples that were standing there, they were busy passing out all the food to all 15,000 people that were there. And so when everybody had eaten and everybody had gotten full, here they are, they've got these 12 baskets, and Jesus said, here's some doggy bags for you to take on our next journey, because it wasn't over yet. But here, Jesus also tests the faith. Jesus tests the faith of his disciples. Now, these disciples, let me just tell you this. Miracles at this particular point in time in Jesus' ministry were not a surprise to the disciples. They had seen him. They had just witnessed him healing the man that had been lame for 38 years at the pool of Bethsaida. They had just, it wasn't long before this, that they had watched him calm the storms. It wasn't long before this until they just saw Jesus heal an entire city. And so this was, miracles were not something that was huge and surprising, but yet Jesus still finds, in my opinion, Jesus still finds a teaching moment for his disciples, which I think is also a teaching moment for the church. And so look here at what happens. So we're going to back up a few scriptures here. It says, therefore Jesus, in verse 5, therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? Verse 6, this he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. So Jesus knew what he was going to do, but yet he wanted to test his disciples. He wanted to test Philip, and he wanted to test his other disciples. How are we going to feed all of these people? When Philip here responds back to Jesus, his response is, listen, even if we could find a place that had enough bread to feed all of these people, we don't have enough money to buy it to feed all of these people. Do you understand how expensive it would be to feed 10 to 15,000 people? And not just feed them, but Jesus' intentions were to make them full. How in the world do we, my appetite is different from somebody else's appetite, and your appetite is probably different than mine. And so there are some, and especially if they had some teenagers that were there, listen, some teenagers can pack some groceries. And so I'm thinking, you know what? There may be some people here that could eat, and how in the world are we going to feed all of them, Jesus asks. And so then Andrew comes up and says, hey, there's a little boy over here that's got 5 barley loaves. So when we look at a barley loaf, does everybody know, what a loaf of like banana bread looks like? So we're talking about a loaf that's probably not even that big, right? And so he has 5 of those. And then he has 2 fish. We have no idea the size of the fish. Obviously, he's a little boy, so he's not carrying around a 30-pound catfish on his shoulder, right? And so he's got 2 fish on him. And so Andrew says, listen, so we've got a little boy that's got some bread and got a couple of fish. But that doesn't equal what we have in front of us. It doesn't compare of what lies in front of us. We've got 15,000 people that are sitting here. This might feed 2 or 3 of us. So Jesus took the loaves and he took the fish and he blessed it. And as he blessed it, he began to break it up. And he began to give it to the disciples, and the disciples began to pass it out. Now, I could imagine of what that must have been like when the disciples saw what was there to begin with. And I want to take this visual away from everybody as well, because I remember when I was a kid and I heard this story. I'm a very imaginative person, and so my imagination runs wild on me sometimes. And so when I heard this story as a kid, I pictured Jesus taking these 2 fish and these pieces of bread and praying over them, and then all of a sudden, just like piles of fish just showed up, and piles of bread just showed up, and so people just started coming up and grabbing bread and grabbing fish and going back to their seat. That's how I envisioned it. But that's not how it happened. how it happened is that Jesus takes these 2 fish and these pieces of bread, and he begins to break it out and begins to hand it to his disciples as they begin to pass out to all these people. And it just seemed like it was never ending. Just from these 2 fish and these 5 pieces of bread. And Jesus just continued to hand out, and he just continued to hand out. And it's like, man, how far can 2 fish go? Dale, you're a fisherman. 2 fish don't go a whole lot away, right? And so he just continued to pass out. And continue to pass it until everybody was full. How many times has God asked us to take what seemed to be not enough and give it so that he may bless it? In 6:6, in John chapter 6, verse 6, Jesus knew what he was doing. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing, and he was testing their faith, just as he tests our faith. And I want to say this, is our faith, many times, probably most of the time, is a launching pad for what God wants to do and what he can do. Many times, it's not that God can't do it, and it's not that God won't do it, but it's that God is testing our faith so that he could then use our faith as a launching pad to show others what he can do through those who have faith. And so he's testing them. Many times what happens is that we see the temporal and the tangible in things, right? I mean, take your bank account for an example, right? Our bank accounts are temporal. I don't know about y'all's, mine is. It's there for just a temporary moment. It's temporal, but yet it's tangible too, right? It's something that we can hang on to. I mean, it's our money. It's what we have. It's what we've worked for, right? And so we see the tangible, and we see most of what we have is temporal. But when God looks at things, he sees the eternal and the supernatural. So we see the temporal and we see the tangible, and he sees the eternal and the supernatural of things. And what God is asking us to do, what God is asking us to give, we may think is not enough. We may even think, not that it's not enough for God to use, although that is another side of this, but oftentimes we think, listen, what I'm given is not enough. I don't have enough. I don't give enough. I'm not enough. I'm not worthy. And so oftentimes we just don't give it, and because then we don't give it, God can't bless it. And then there are times that we even have that mentality that, what I give is really not enough, so there's really no sense in me even giving it because what I have is not really enough. Listen, if God can take 2 fish and 5 pieces of bread and feed 15,000 people, I guarantee he could take $1 and change the world. And so oftentimes we see things in that temporal and tangible mindset. God is asking us to give what we see is not enough, what we see is not worthy. That takes our faith to a place that it's this launching pad where he then can multiply and use it far beyond what you and I could ever imagine. I remember when Cand and I we felt God leading us into full-time ministry. It's been many years ago. I was a full-time diesel mechanic, made really good money. And then I was bivocational youth and music pastor. And I really felt God prompting on me that it was, we were supposed to go in full-time ministry. And so going from what we were making and going into what a church was, a church that was looking at us, that we felt God was calling us to, it was more than a half a cut in pay in our salary, a lot more than half a cut in pay in our salary. And so Ken and I, we began to add up. We began to, in fact, we began to put on paper pros and cons, right? We began to put on paper, it's like, okay, here's our finances. Here's everything that we owe versus the money that we would have. And when we get to the bottom line, it wasn't close. It didn't add up. I mean, being close is not even close is not even as much of an understatement. But yet and it's not a pat on our back or any of those kind of things. I don't mean it that way. I'm just trying to show you an example is that God ended up calling us into full-time ministry to that church. I left being diesel mechanic. And in fact, I'll tell you, I look back now and I see this. One of the things that I think God ensured to take away from me that stability that I had from being a diesel mechanic, shortly after we moved to this town, southeast Oklahoma area, my shop was broken into. $40-something thousand worth of tools were stolen out of my shop. Months. I'm talking. We moved there like in April or May, and we had gone to youth camp at the end of June, July area. And so while we were gone to camp is when they broke into my shop, and so all my stability was gone. Like I mean, even if I wanted to work on a truck, I couldn't. I didn't have the tools. And so God kind of removed that stability away from me for a little while, right? But the point of this story is this, is that once we followed, once we just said, okay, God, here's what we have. It's in your hands. I would tell you today, I stand and give all praise to God. There was never a day that we didn't go with what we needed. Oh, there was many days that we went without things that we wanted. We never went without what we needed. Job was provided for Kanda. I was able to do some side jobs eventually. I got some tools back and was able to even do some side work, on the weekends and those kind of things just to make some in. But God always provided. Never went without. He made sure we were full. And it didn't add up. It didn't add up. So, as I was studying today, and I thought, man, how can I press this to the church? And so I come up with this question. What do we see in our life? What do you see in your life? What do you see in your life that is temporal? That you see as temporal and tangible. And you see it, and you look at it, and you're thinking, it's not much. There's no way that God could use that. There's no way that God could use me. There's no way that God could use that amount, and there's no way that God could use those resources. There's no way that, yet, because we have that mindset that we're seeing the temporal and we're seeing the tangible in things, is that we're losing that God can see the eternal and the supernatural in things. What are we not handing over to Him that He wants to multiply? Now, I'm not standing here. The last thing I'm standing here is preaching some kind of prosperity message, because that's what I'm not doing. But what I am saying is that I will tell you that when we finally hand over to God what we see as temporal and tangible and not worthy or not enough, God says, let me have it, and so I can use it. Let me have it so I can multiply it. Let me have it so I can show people who I am. most of the time, we do this with our finances, right? Most time is that there was times in ministry, and then there's times even when we were first getting in ministry and even outside of ministry that we ask ourselves, like, you know what, can we afford to tithe? And this is not a tithing message, by the way, but can we afford to tithe? I mean, I'm looking at the house bill, I'm looking at the car bill, I'm looking at gas bill, I'm looking at the electric bill, I'm looking at the food bill, I'm looking at 2 college kids' bill, I'm looking at this bill, I'm looking at that bill. Can I afford to tithe? I mean, I get, we're looking at all these things, and so many times we're looking at all these tangible things in our life. And let me just tell you my experience. So we can't afford not to tithe. We can't afford not to give. I could probably stand here just as well as you probably could too, and tell you story after story of how God has blessed our family, how God has blessed me, how God has blessed in circumstances through obedience and tithing and giving. But we do this even outside of money. Right, so let's take it a step further than just money. What about our gifts and our talents? What about the ways that God has gifted us and God has talented us, the passions in which that God has given us? What about those? I'm really not good enough. I can't do that. Man, I don't feel worthy to do. Listen, I would tell you, never in my life have I ever felt worthy of this call right here. In fact, the moment that I do, I will step down. See, what makes us worthy is not us. What makes us worthy is not our abilities. What makes us worthy is not our talents. What makes us worthy is Jesus. That's what makes us worthy. So let me be blunt with you for just a moment. For the ones of us that say, listen, I'm not good enough or I'm not worthy, you're simply saying Jesus is not good enough or worthy. Because he's what makes you worthy. He's what makes you good enough to be called, to be a minister of the gospel, to be involved in ministry. Listen, we are all called to be ministers of the gospel. Every believer, every born-again believer is called to be a minister of the gospel. And so what abilities, what gifts, what talents, what resources? Yeah, I tell people this all the time. People that call the church and they ask for help. We have a limited budget. We have an extremely limited budget to be able to help people. But I have a resource outside of the church that helps assist those in need. And here's the thing about them is that that's my resource, and then they have a huge resource of other people. And so my question is that what resources do we have? What talents do we have? What gifts do we have? What abilities do we have? What passions do we have that you've been holding back from God? Because you think it's not good enough, or you think it's not enough, or you think it's not worthy. When Andrew comes to Jesus with the lad, with the boy, he says, "This is what we have." Do you think that Andrew, or any of the other disciples for that matter, do you think they could have imagined Jesus feeding those people? All of those people. 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. Do we, I mean, I don't think personally that Andrew or any of the other disciples had any clue that Jesus would or even could do what he did. But they saw it. And as all of these people were fed, and there was more that was taken up besides that, I believe for the disciples to have a doggy bag to go home with, is that Jesus wanted to show his disciples, the ones that had been walking with him, the ones that had seen him do miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. And Jesus wanted to show them, listen, I can even do more. I can do more. I can do more than what you ever thought I could. And so I wonder to myself, and I wonder for us as a church, what would it look like for you personally? What would it look like for us as a church if we really believed that Jesus can do more than what we ever thought he could with what we have? I mean, I think we would be shocked. I think we would be surprised. We shouldn't be, but I think we would be. And so I ask us to ask ourselves that question: what am I looking at in my life that is the temporal and the tangible that I'm holding back from God because I don't think it's good enough? I don't think it's enough. And God's just waiting for you to put your faith in him so that you can watch him multiply in a supernatural way, far beyond our imagination. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you. First off, I thank you that you are God that sees past our doubts. That oftentimes we look at many things of our life thinking that it's not enough, or it's not good enough, or not worthy enough. And God, you say, just give it to me and let me do what I do. Let me multiply it. Let me bless it. So God, I pray that us as individuals, us as the overall church, that God, that we would truly put our faith and our trust in you. And that God, that we would allow our faith to be that launching pad to see what you want to do in multiplying the things in which that we have that we don't think is enough. That God, you do know it's enough. And so God, would you just give us that faith? Strengthen us, grow us in our spiritual maturity, that we would have that faith. And that, Father, that we can stand on the backside of it and give you all the praise and glory for every bit of it. So God, we thank you today. We ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. Those of you joining us online, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you come back and visit us again next week.